There used to be a guy at my high school named Derek. Almost everyone picked on him. Not quietly either. People mocked him right to his face. To be fair, Derek didn't exactly make it easy for himself. He had a habit of snapping at people, getting into arguments, and losing his temper over the smallest things. Teachers were a frequent target. He would interrupt lessons, raise his voice, and insist that whatever they were teaching was wrong. From what people said, a lot of those opinions came straight from his parents, the kind of stuff that clashed with everything being taught in class. Whether it was politics or history, Derek treated every lesson like it was some kind of personal battle. Maybe that wasn't entirely his fault, but nobody at school cared about that nuance. And it didn't help that he was difficult to be around. Conversations with him were awkward and uncomfortable, like talking to someone who was always half ready to explode. Most people tried to avoid him completely. At one point, he almost got expelled. He had been harassing a girl pretty aggressively after she turned him down. Word sprayed quickly about what happened. After that, whatever little patience people still had for him pretty much disappeared. Looking back now, I sometimes think things might have turned out differently if the school had actually kicked him out back then. But they didn't. The whole situation really started one Friday during our American history class. We were in the middle of a lesson about the Civil War when Derek suddenly interrupted the teacher. At first, it sounded like he was asking a question, but within seconds, it turned into an argument. He insisted the teacher was lying about certain historical facts and started going off on some rant that made almost no sense. Our teacher, Mr. Callahan, didn't lose his temper. He just calmly responded with dates, documents, and direct quotes from historical sources. Piece by piece, he dismantled everything Derek was saying. The class started laughing. Not loudly at first, just a few snickers here and there. But the more Derek talked, the worse it got. Mr. Callahan kept correcting him, and every correction seemed to make Derek more embarrassed. His face turned red, his voice got louder, and eventually he started shouting about how the country had been ruined. At that point, the whole class was openly laughing. Derek slammed his chair back, shouted something none of us could really understand, and stormed out of the classroom. That was the last time anyone saw him that week. Over the weekend, things got strange. Several people from school started sharing screenshots from Derek's Snapchat. He had posted a bunch of pictures. In one of them, he was holding different guns from what he claimed was his dad's collection. In another, he was posing in front of a flag hanging on the wall behind him. But the one that made everyone uncomfortable was the last photo. It was a printed picture of Mr. Callahan's face taped to a cardboard box. The photo was full of bullet holes. The caption underneath said, "Getting ready for Monday." At the time, most people treated it like a bad joke. For years, students had joked that Derek would snap one day and do something crazy, but nobody actually believed he had the nerve to go through with it. A few people reported the posts to the school. What they probably should have done was reported to the police. I didn't take it seriously either. If I had, there's no way I would have shown up at school that Monday morning. But I did, and so did everyone else. What we later learned was that Derek didn't show up to school until late in the day. It was already fifth period, and fifth period just happened to be American history. From what we were told afterward, Derek tried to walk into the building like it was a normal day, but someone had already seen the Snapchat posts. The school resource officer and two administrators were waiting for him near the entrance. They stopped him and asked to search his backpack. That's when everything went wrong. Instead of handing it over, Derek pulled out a handgun and fired. The shot hit the officer before anyone could react, and Derek took off running down the hallway. I didn't see any of this happen. What I did hear was the gunshot. I was in a classroom on the other side of the school when it echoed through the building.
The sound was so sharp and sudden that the entire class froze. For a few seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then the announcement came over the loudspeaker. Lockdown. This is not a drill. You know those lockdown drills schools make you do every few months? The ones everyone treats like a joke? Suddenly, they didn't seem so stupid anymore. Our teacher immediately got up and locked the classroom door. The lights were switched off, and he told us to get down and hide against the far wall where we couldn't be seen from the hallway window. Everyone moved quickly, but you could feel the panic starting to spread. And then someone whispered the name that was already forming in everyone's head. It's Derek. I looked at Mr. Callahan. His face had gone completely pale. For a second, I saw something flash through my mind. The photo Derek had posted online. The one with our teacher's face taped to a box and shot full of holes. We all knew who Derek was coming for. We barely had time to hide before footsteps slammed down the hallway. They stopped right outside our door. Then came the pounding. Derek started slamming his fists against the door, shouting, "Open it! I know you're in there!" A few students began crying quietly, pressing their sleeves against their mouths so the sound wouldn't carry. Others were pulling out their phones, texting parents, sending messages, even live streaming, like they were trying to leave some kind of record behind. I remember thinking the same thing most of them probably were. This is how I die. Not running, not fighting, just sitting on a cold tile floor in a dark classroom, waiting. The banging got louder. Derek was kicking the door now. Someone whispered that the lock wouldn't hold. And then suddenly, a gunshot. Everyone screamed. The room exploded into chaos. Some people crawled deeper into the corner. Others covered their heads. Nobody knew if the bullet had come through the door. In the middle of that panic, I made the worst decision I've ever made in my life. Instead of staying hidden, I ran to the window. Our classroom was on the second floor. My thinking was simple. If Derek got inside, jumping was better than sitting there waiting to be shot. A few other students followed me, but I hesitated. The light switch wouldn't open easily, and I fumbled with it for a few seconds too long. Someone behind me got impatient and shoved me out of the way. I fell hard onto the floor. When I looked back toward the door, something strange caught my attention. Derek wasn't standing there anymore. He was holding his face with both hands, staggering backward down the hallway. Blood was running through his fingers. For a moment, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. The door handle on our side looked crooked, bent at an angle like something had smashed into it. Our teacher was yelling for everyone to get away from the windows and hide again, but I couldn't stop staring. Then the thoughts slipped out of my mouth before I even realized I was speaking. I think Derek shot himself. I said it quietly, almost like I didn't believe it, but enough people heard me that the room suddenly went silent. One of my friends slowly crawled up to the door window and looked out into the hallway, and that's when we saw Derek again. He was stumbling away down the corridor, leaving drops of blood behind him. His voice echoed through the building. He was crying.
For a few seconds, nobody in our classroom moved. The hallway outside had gone quiet except for Derek's distant, uneven footsteps and the sound of him shouting in pain somewhere farther down the corridor. I slowly got up and walked toward the door with my friend. The hallway window beside it gave us a narrow angle to look through. There was blood on the floor. Not a lot,
but enough to leave a trail. Behind us, Mr. Callahan was yelling for everyone to stay away from the door and get back to the corner. His voice sounded strained now, like he was forcing himself to stay calm, but none of us could stop staring. I reached for the handle without really thinking. If Derek was gone, maybe we could get out, maybe we could run. The handle didn't move. I tried again, twisting harder. Still nothing. At first, I thought it was just locked, but classroom doors are designed to open from the inside during lockdowns. They're supposed to. That's when I noticed the metal around the lock had warped outward, like something inside the mechanism had exploded. The bullet. Derek must have tried to shoot the lock open from the outside. Instead of breaking it, he had completely destroyed the mechanism, jamming the door shut from both sides. We weren't locked in, we were sealed in. I stepped back slowly, feeling that strange numbness people get when their brain is trying to process something it can't quite accept. The door wasn't opening. Not for us, not for anyone. But at least Derek was gone. For the next few minutes, we stayed where we were, sitting on the floor in the dark. Nobody talked much. Every little noise from the hallway made people tense up again. Sirens eventually started echoing outside the building. Police, paramedics, more officers moving through the halls. But because the lock was destroyed, they couldn't open our door either. They had to move room by room, securing the building before anyone could even try to get us out. It felt like hours. Maybe it actually was. Eventually, someone came with tools and forced the door open. The hallway outside looked like a crime scene, because it was. Later, we learned what had really happened. When Derek tried to shoot the door lock, the bullet hit the metal mechanism and shattered it. Pieces of twisted metal blasted outward like shrapnel. One of those fragments flew straight into his face. It struck his eye. That's why he suddenly backed away from the door and ran. The injury completely blinded him in one eye and left him bleeding heavily. His whole attack ended right there in that hallway. He never made it into the classroom. Police found him a few minutes later wandering outside the school, disoriented and screaming. Eventually, he surrendered without another shot being fired. The resource officer he shot survived, which honestly felt like a miracle. Derek, on the other hand, was charged as an adult. From what I heard, he ended up receiving a sentence that will keep him in prison for a long time. Sometimes I still think about how close everything came to turning out differently. If that piece of metal had flown another direction, if the door lock had broken the way he expected, if he had managed to get inside the classroom, there probably would have been a lot of bodies on that floor. Instead, the only thing that stopped him was a piece of shattered metal flying the wrong way. And that's the only reason any of us walked out of that room alive.
The lockdown that scared me the most didn't involve a shooter. There were no gunshots, no police chasing someone through the halls. It was just a student everyone already knew was dangerous. His name was Marcus. Marcus was one of those kids teachers described as gifted, but nobody really knew what to do with him. He was incredibly smart, the kind of student who could finish assignments in half the time everyone else needed. But he had serious problems with authority. He argued with teachers constantly. He refused to follow instructions, and socially, he just didn't seem to connect with people the way everyone else did. Most schools have at least one kid like that. Marcus was ours. Before the end of sophomore year, he had already been suspended once for bringing a knife to school. The official story was that he forgot it was in his backpack, but nobody believed that. A few months later, things got worse. During an argument in class, Marcus tried to strangle a teacher with a shoelace. After that, he was expelled. For a while, everyone thought we were done hearing about him, but the next school year he came back. Apparently, he had spent several months at some kind of intervention school, a place for students with behavioral problems. If the idea was to help him improve, it didn't seem to work.
In fact, Marcus seemed different when he returned. Not calmer, just darker. I only spoke to him once, and it happened completely by accident. One day, both of us got sent to the front office for unrelated things. I had skipped a class earlier that week and finally got caught. Marcus had been arguing with a teacher again. We ended up sitting in those uncomfortable plastic chairs outside the assistant principal's office waiting to be called in. She was already in a meeting, so we had to wait. Marcus started talking almost immediately. At first, it was just random conversation about the intervention school he had been sent to. He described the kinds of kids that went there: arsonists, drug dealers, gang members. He talked about them like they were celebrities. The way he told the stories, you would have thought he had just come back from summer camp instead of some disciplinary program. And the weirdest part? He seemed genuinely happy while talking about it, almost excited. I remember thinking that maybe the place had helped him find friends or something. Maybe being around people like that made him feel like he finally belonged somewhere. For a while, the conversation was almost entertaining. Then Marcus said something that made my stomach drop. He casually mentioned that one of the kids there had shown him how to build a bomb. He said it the way someone might talk about learning a new video game trick. I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was joking. Right before I could ask, the assistant principal opened her door and called his name. Marcus stood up, smiled at me, and walked into the office. That was the only real conversation I ever had with him, and the last time I ever spoke to him at all.
A few weeks later, something happened that nobody in the school expected. It was during second period on a normal weekday morning. Classes had just started when the announcement came over the speakers, telling everyone to remain where they were. At first, it sounded routine, the kind of message we heard occasionally when something small was happening on campus. But within a couple minutes, teachers started checking their phones and whispering to each other. Then the order came: full evacuation. Nobody explained why. Our class lined up and started moving toward the exits with the rest of the students. When you evacuate a school with over 1,000 kids inside, it quickly turns into a slow-moving crowd packed shoulder to shoulder in the hallways. That's when I saw Marcus being escorted away by 2 administrators. He didn't look scared. If anything, he looked satisfied. We were later told that Marcus had called in a bomb threat from a phone inside the school. The problem was that when they caught him, he refused to say where the bomb was, so the entire building had to be evacuated. We were being directed toward the football field, which was the designated assembly area whenever something like this happened. Everyone moved slowly across campus while teachers tried to keep students grouped together. That's when something caught my eye. As we were walking down one of the hallways, I noticed a clear backpack sitting against the wall. Inside the backpack was a black garbage bag tightly stuffed into it. The bag was bulging like something large was hidden inside. My stomach immediately dropped. I pointed it out to one of the administrators nearby. Within seconds, they were speaking urgently into their radios. The hallway was cleared, and everyone was pushed outside faster. At the time, I remember feeling strangely proud of myself, like I had helped stop something dangerous. But the fear hit me a few minutes later when we reached the football field. The entire student body was sitting on the bleachers under the hot sun while police began searching the school building. Bomb squad teams had been called in. Nobody was allowed to leave. At first, everyone was tense and quiet, but after an hour passed, the mood slowly changed. Fear turned into boredom. People started talking, joking around, checking their phones. Teachers were trying to keep us seated and calm, but the longer we stayed out there, the harder it became. Eventually, I started messing around with a couple friends sitting next to me.
I pretended I was getting heat stroke and dramatically leaned back like I was about to faint. Nobody bought it. They told me to stop being an idiot. So, as a joke, I stretched out across their legs and pretended I needed to lie down. Everyone started laughing and pushing me away. But while I was lying there, staring down at the metal bleacher bench beneath us, something caught my attention. There was a small box taped tightly in duct tape, and taped to the side of it was a note. The note said, "This is the real one."
For a second, I just stared at it. My brain didn't immediately accept what I was seeing. It felt like one of those moments where reality pauses for a second while your mind tries to catch up. Then, everything hit me at once. The bomb threat, Marcus, the evacuation, and the fact that I was currently lying on the bleachers directly next to something that looked exactly like a bomb. I jumped up so fast I twisted my ankle on the metal bench. "Get up! Get up!" I shouted. The kids sitting around me thought I was still joking. One of them laughed and told me to relax. I grabbed his shoulder and pointed under the seat. "Look!" He leaned forward, confused at first. Then he saw it. The change in his face was instant. Within seconds, panic started spreading through the section of the bleachers like electricity. Someone yelled the word bomb, and that was all it took. 1,000 students suddenly realized they might be sitting next to an explosive. People began scrambling in every direction at once. Teachers were shouting for everyone to stay calm, but nobody was listening anymore. The bleachers emptied in seconds as students shoved past each other trying to get away. I saw people trip over the metal steps while others jumped straight down onto the grass to run. Some students climbed the fences surrounding the field. Others sprinted toward the parking lot. A group of kids ran straight out to the road. The panic spread so quickly that it became impossible to control. Freshmen were getting knocked over by older students trying to push through the crowd. A couple of them were trampled before teachers managed to drag them out of the way. The whole situation was chaos. And the worst part? There was nowhere safe to run. We were already outside. If the bomb was real, it could have been anywhere. By the time police managed to restore some order, most of the school had already scattered. Students were hiding in nearby stores, parking lots, and neighborhoods surrounding the campus. Some people simply ran all the way home. Eventually, the bomb squad inspected the device taped under the bleachers. Then they inspected the backpack I had reported earlier in the hallway. And after hours of searching the entire campus, the truth finally came out. None of the bombs were real. The box under the bleachers? Fake. The bag inside the backpack? Also fake. Marcus had built convincing replicas, but they contained nothing dangerous. The entire bomb threat had been staged. The thing that made it even more disturbing was the reason behind it. Marcus wasn't trying to kill anyone. He was trying to get himself sent back to the intervention school. If he had actually used real explosives, he would have gone to prison for years. But fake bombs? That meant juvenile detention or another behavioral program. Everything we went through that day, the fear, the evacuation, the panic on the football field, had all been part of a sick game he was playing. And the worst part is that Marcus was smart enough to build a real bomb if he wanted to. If he had decided to do that instead, a lot of people probably wouldn't have made it home that day. I have no idea where Marcus ended up after that, but I've never forgotten the feeling of seeing that box taped under the bleachers, because for a few seconds, I was absolutely certain that everyone sitting there was about to die.
I grew up in Oklahoma, right in the middle of what people call Tornado Alley. Severe weather was just a normal part of life there. Because of that, Tornado drills were something we did at school constantly. Long before school started practicing lockdowns for other emergencies, we were already used to emergency drills for storms. At least once a month, teachers would suddenly stop class and tell everyone to line up in the hallway. The lights would be turned off, and we'd all kneel down facing the wall with our heads tucked low and our arms covering our necks. It was supposed to protect us if debris came flying through the building. At the time, though, it mostly just felt awkward, especially for me. I was in middle school in the late 90s, and the position we were told to sit in meant leaning forward with your head down and your back raised. As a girl, it always made me feel like I was exposing myself to every teacher walking past. No matter how uncomfortable it was, the rules were strict. You didn't move, you didn't talk, you stayed exactly where you were until the drill ended. Eventually, I started dreading those drills more than the idea of an actual tornado. Tornadoes didn't hit often, but the drills, those happened all the time. And sometimes the lockdowns weren't drills at all. Certain times of the year brought real storms through the area almost weekly. One afternoon during my 7th grade year, one of those real storms rolled in. At the time, my class wasn't in the main school building. Because the school was overcrowded, several classrooms had been placed in temporary buildings outside. Everyone called them portables, even though they were basically small, flimsy structures that never moved. If severe weather hit while you were in one of those buildings, the rule was simple: you ran. Students had to immediately leave everything behind, backpacks, books, everything, and run inside the main building to shelter in the interior hallways. That's exactly what happened that day. The announcement came over the loudspeaker telling all portable classrooms to evacuate immediately. Our class grabbed nothing and rushed across the courtyard toward the main building while the wind was already starting to pick up. Within minutes, we were all lined up in the hallway in the usual storm position, kneeling, heads down, hands over our necks. At first, it felt like any other drill. Teachers were talking in calm voices, explaining that a strong cyclonic storm was approaching and there was a high probability of tornado activity in the area. At the time, most of that sounded like confusing adult language, but there were a few words everyone understood. Possible tornado. Normally, when we did these drills, people whispered, joked quietly, or complained about their knees hurting on the hard floor. This time was different. The hallway was almost silent. Outside, the wind kept getting louder. Then, the sky started to change. Even though the lights were off like usual, we could still see daylight coming through the windows at the ends of the hallway. Slowly, that light disappeared. Within minutes, the sky outside had gone so dark it looked like night. Someone whispered that it felt like a horror movie. No one laughed. Then, the hail started.
At first, it sounded like a few pebbles hitting the doors. Then, it turned into a constant barrage. Hailstones were slamming into the building so hard, it sounded like someone was dumping buckets of gravel onto the roof. The metal doors rattled with every impact. The wind kept getting stronger. You could hear it pushing against the walls of the school like something alive outside trying to force its way in. Teachers walked back and forth down the hallway telling everyone to stay calm, but their voices were tighter than usual. Even they sounded nervous. The noise outside kept building. Rain, hail, wind. Then, underneath all of it, another sound started creeping in. At first it was so low you could barely hear it, a distant rumble. It reminded me of a train moving somewhere far away, the kind of deep vibration you feel in your chest before you actually hear it clearly. But there were no train tracks anywhere near the school. The sound kept getting louder and louder. Soon everyone in the hallway could hear it. Someone whispered the word tornado. A few students started crying. Teachers told everyone to keep their heads down, but you could hear the fear in their voices now too. The walls began to shake. Lockers rattled. The doors at the end of the hallway slammed violently against their frames as the wind outside slammed into them. By that point, nobody needed to say it out loud. We all knew the tornado was very close. Closer than any drill we had ever practiced for. The roaring outside became overwhelming, a deep, violent sound that filled the entire building. It really did sound like a freight train racing directly over the roof. Debris started hitting the walls. Heavy objects slammed into the doors with loud crashes before being ripped away again by the wind. Teachers finally stopped pretending everything was fine. Several of them dropped down to the floor with us. For a moment, the entire hallway was silent except for the storm. Hundreds of students kneeling in the dark. Everyone waiting. The air itself felt different, vibrating, almost humming from the pressure outside. Then, something inside the building gave way. One of the windows at the end of the hallway shattered. The sound was sharp and violent. A blast of wind rushed into the building instantly, carrying dust and pieces of debris with it. Papers flew through the hallway like birds. Someone screamed. For a few seconds, it felt like the entire building might rip apart. I remember squeezing my eyes shut and thinking that the roof was about to disappear and we were all going to be lifted straight into the sky. But just as suddenly as the storm reached its peak, it started to fade. The roaring wind slowly weakened. The crashing sounds outside became less frequent. The pressure in the air eased. After a few minutes, the hallway grew quiet again. Teachers cautiously stood up and looked around. Nobody said anything at first. Finally, one of them spoke. The storm had passed. The lockdown was over. Students slowly stood up, stretching sore legs and backs after sitting on the hard floor for so long. Everyone looked exhausted, but we were alive. The school building had taken some damage, but it was still standing. For a moment, it felt like everything had turned out okay, until we walked outside.
When we stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything had become. Just minutes earlier, the air had been roaring with wind and debris. Now the storm had moved on, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The sky looked strangely bright again. Sunlight was breaking through the clouds like nothing had happened. But the school grounds told a completely different story. Branches and pieces of metal were scattered across the field. Trash cans had been thrown across the parking lot. Parts of fencing were bent or torn loose. The main building had some broken windows and visible damage, but it was still standing. Then I looked toward the area where the portable classrooms had been, and I stopped walking. They were gone. Not damaged, not tipped over, just gone. Where several portable buildings had stood that morning, there was now nothing but patches of torn earth, scattered debris, and a few exposed pipes sticking up from the ground. It looked like someone had erased the buildings from existence. Teachers began moving students away from the area, telling everyone to stay back while they assessed the damage. But I couldn't stop staring. My classroom had been one of those portables. My backpack had been inside, my notebooks, my diary, a scrapbook I had been working on for months. All of it had disappeared somewhere out in the fields beyond the school. For a moment, I felt strangely sad about losing those things. Then the reality of the situation finally settled in. If we hadn't evacuated the portable buildings when the announcement came,
If we had stayed in class even a few minutes longer, every student in that room would have been sitting inside one of those buildings when the tornado hit. And judging by what was left of them, we would have been completely helpless. The tornado ripped them apart like they were made of paper. Standing there on that field, looking at the empty space where my classroom used to be, I felt something I had never experienced before. The realization of how close you came to dying, not in some dramatic movie moment, just by being in the wrong place a few minutes too long. Since then, I've never taken severe weather warnings lightly. Living in Tornado Alley means storms like that are always a possibility. And even though that happened decades ago, I still remember the sound of that tornado getting closer. That deep, rising roar like a train coming straight toward you. The kind of sound you never forget once you hear it.